Welcome to episode 35 of the Half Point Per podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined by Dalton Willie, and back in the flesh, producer Johnny Pham. Johnny, how does it feel to be back after I think 2-week absence? Well, actually more than that because we weren't every week until last week. It's been
it was a 2-week hiatus, I'd say.
It was 2 shows. I don't know about 2 weeks though.
2 shows, 2 weeks, kind of same thing.
Yeah,
it's good to be back. Good to be back. I feel like we're getting into the swing of things, to the thicker stuff, to where like the season's basically just around the corner. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, we're to the point where I don't have to say, okay, let's remember that and revisit for a bet later on. We're at the point where we'll probably start getting some bets on the spreadsheet sooner or later. The preseason spreadsheet full of Roto World blurbs is really heating up every day. I add at least one or two fun blurbs today. It's Jonathan Taylor and Joe Mixon time on the spreadsheet. Dalton, I know you had some Jonathan Taylor thoughts. How are you, bud?
I have no Jonathan Taylor thoughts that I want to put in audio recording on this
podcast.
podcast.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to admit that I uttered Trent Richardson in the same sentence as Jonathan Taylor either.
I will say I was doing some research, and there are some pretty accurate statistical comparisons between the two of them that would be pause for concern. And if we were going down hot take street, maybe if we have like a hot takes episode, that might get thrown in there that Jonathan Taylor is going to flame out just like Trent Richardson. And his fun fact, Trent Richardson is actually playing in the Mexican Football League, which I did not know existed.
That is a very fun fact. It tells me that you got way too deep into this research, and now I think we could do a hot takes segment. I don't think this show could survive an entire show of hot takes, though. I think we'd say entirely way too many dumb things.
B. Cole is going to supplant Tyreek Hill this season. My second hot take. We're just doing this.
Well, we will get to the Chiefs eventually. We've got the AFC preview on deck today. If you listened last week to the NFC, it's just going to be just like that show format. We're going to run through every team. We're each going to give one storyline we're kind of watching, and obviously kind of take a side or give an opinion along with that. And we will try to keep it at about 4 minutes per team. Some of them, in the AFC especially, will be a little shorter, and some of them, kind of like the Seahawks and Rams last week to end it, were a little more interesting. So if you want to listen to the NFC and you haven't yet, after you listen to this one, go back and listen to that last week's show. It was honestly, it was a good show, and you might come out of that one feeling pretty differently about the Seahawks and the passing game. If you want to go ahead and fast forward to the end, if that's all you want to hear. We had a pretty good conversation about them, I think. But Dalton, let's jump right into the AFC here, and I think where we're going to start is your Buffalo Bills. So I will let you kick us off.
Woo! Well, this is an unfortunate one for me to kick off with because I don't have a lot to say here because I think the Buffalo Bills are going to be a lot of the same we saw last season. They're going to run a lot of full wide receiver sets. I think the targets are largely going to go to Stephon Diggs and Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley, and there's going to be some sporadic games from the wide receiver 4.
Speaking of blurbs, we had some sad Gabriel Davis blurbage today.
Very sad, but for anybody who owns him in Dynasty, like me, remember it's second year and Emmanuel Sanders is 34. But what I want to talk about with the Buffalo Bills is I wanted to say the blurbs that came out today about Zach Moss, I'm not buying into it just because the way this offense is going to run. I don't think there's going to be a valuable rusher in it. Mm-hmm. But secondly, are you at all concerned that this situation changes? Because I'm pretty sure Zach Ertz is going to be a Bill by the start of the season. I think it's just a matter of what pieces get moved.
I don't want to get too deep into that before we even know. I would hate to really put that much thought and effort and analysis out there on that and then have it not happen. But what I would say, if you're drafting right now, it wouldn't change how I feel about, obviously Allen or even Stephon Diggs. It would make me more hesitant on the rest of the guys there in the passing game, Sanders, Cole Beasley mainly. But at the end of the day, those guys are pretty ancillary weapons on your fantasy team. So even if it does happen, it's not like it's, a crushing blow to your team because those guys' value gets dinged,
Yeah, I really think he'll be a good playoff guy who gets a couple of third downs, and he has a Super Bowl on his resume, and I think he's a locker room guy. I don't think there's a big fantasy implication, and it probably hurts his value too. But
yeah, compared to being on the Eagles, like how it's been years past, for sure. It's funny you brought up Zach Moss. I was kind of wondering as I was looking through just Bill's stuff and rankings, is this backfield actually being undervalued just a little bit? It's funny. I came away thinking, no, probably not. But I do think if you can pinpoint a guy, which it's funny, the Zach Moss blurb came out today. It's if you feel like you can pinpoint a guy, and it'll probably be him. It sounds like if it's either of them who kind of takes that lead role, I do think there's a little bit of value to be had there in drafts. Not much, not like I think he's going to be a top 24 back, but these are guys going. I think Moss is like the RB 35, Singletary is like RB 43. So it's just kind of a chance to hit on value late at the running back position a little bit. Last year, and see Brian DeBoll, their offensive coordinator, talked the other day or a couple weeks ago, and he pretty much made it sound like, yeah, we're not going to run the ball just for the sake of like we want to be more balanced and we want to, we got to have better rushing stats. Like that's just not going to happen. It doesn't sound like. But what I will say with the Bills, both Singletary and Moss were in the bottom 10 among running backs with 100 or more carries and yards before contact. Singletary 1.5, Moss 1.8. Just any improvement there would do a lot for their efficiency and in turn their fantasy value. The other thing just to kind of keep in mind, both for maybe Josh Allen and for these running backs, not that either of them are touchdown makers or probably ever going to be touchdown makers, but Josh Allen he was number one in the NFL in touchdown passes inside the 10-yard line and inside the 20-yard line. Aaron Rodgers is number one, Josh Allen number two, but Aaron Rodgers in 2019 was 14th. And then the year before that, just as low. So that's a tough thing to know if that carries over year to year. So there is at least potential for upside there, and you don't have to spend hardly anything to get, Moss would be the preference on your team. So that's my only takeaway, really. We know about Diggs. We know the other guys are kind of ancillary weapons. Just wondering if maybe there's value to be had, not top 24, but at least like a good guy to have on your roster as a bye week fill-in.
Caught a little Zach or Josh Allen their love from you, Evan. So that's new. I will say my concern is I think Josh Allen is the best red zone rushing quarterback in the NFL. I mean, he outpaces Zeke since he came in the league with touchdowns. And just some of the guys going around those two, like Michael Carter, Tony Pollard, I just see, at least with those two, just picking two names out of a hat, I see an upside scenario where with, Singletary and Moss, I think there's just really not a scenario where they just really turn into top 24 backs. But I do like the bi-weekly fill-in idea.
Yeah. So this is fun. I just now started recording on the local side of things again. So Johnny, we're looking forward to another YouTube conversion this week. That's going to be a fun time. Something almost as grueling as that is trying to figure out the Miami Dolphins, Dalton. I'm having a tough time. I'm sure you're having a tough time. I think they're a fantasy quagmire this year, which it's weird for a team. Usually those teams are the teams that we expect to go, whatever, I guess there's 17 games now, 4-13, 5-12, like those kinds of teams. Not a team that is either going to be competing with the Bills for the division or maybe even better than the Bills. I mean, their roster is awesome. It obviously depends on Tua a lot, but I think really my takeaway from thinking about the Dolphins and thinking about who I want at their ADP, you think about Fuller at 7-12, Gaskin at 4-9 on Fantasy Calculator. I think I'm taking Jalen Waddle just because he's the cheapest at the very beginning of the 10th. If I have to pick a guy with price factor, then he's going as like barely a top 50 wide receiver. Tua obviously last year struggled in a lot of ways. One of those ways was delivering throws in the tight windows, which is kind of why Devontae Parker and like Preston Williams weren't really great fits last year. May not be this year if that continues to be an issue for him. And so you've got a guy in Waddle who, number one, he's very familiar with. Number two, when he gets open, he is going to be very open because he is fast. He's a great route runner, and he's going to get schemed the ball a lot in kind of that extended running game. So, and he's a guy who, we talked about this a little bit at draft time. I'm not saying that he should be directly compared to Tyreek Hill, but the Tyreek Hill comparisons get thrown out there a lot. And if you're just talking about from a pure, not even pure speed, because I think Tyreek Hill has a faster 40 time by a decent amount, but just like when you watch him, the acceleration and like the quick twitch on his route running, man, he just has the ability to be just a game breaker. And he to me is the best combination of low price and upside on this team.
Yeah. So my takeaway from this team was that it's going to be drastically different from last year. Last season, no team relied more on needing to be within the 20s to score a touchdown. 87.2% of their touchdowns came from within the 20s. And they only had 5 touchdowns from outside the 20s, which is incredibly low. Mm-hmm. And then I did a little more digging, and this is from Sharp Football Analyst. The team that had the most touchdowns outside the red zone was Houston, with 33.2% of their touchdowns coming from outside the red zone, and Will Fuller accounting for 18% of those touchdowns. So the Miami Dolphins made a very, very obvious need that, Jakeem Grant and everybody else on that team just could not catch the ball when they were open deep. Mm-hmm. They had the highest drop rate in the NFL on passes over 20 yards. It's just not looking good for them in that sense. And I really think my takeaway was that I really want Will Fuller. And I think Waddle's probably a better buy in Dynasty, but I think Fuller is just a guy who can do it at the NFL level, and we know he can do it. And I still think, he's being underpriced as ADP. He's going to be suspended the first game. Mm-hmm. But I mean, last season, and granted, it was with a much better quarterback, he was on pace to be the wide receiver 5 to end the season. Mm-hmm. And he has that within his wheelhouse. And last year, he just he ran intermediate routes too and short routes very, very well, which is something we were still questioning he could do at the NFL level until last season.
Yeah, no, he one thing I'll say about Will Fuller is you're right. It was a much better quarterback. And the other thing is just he was not the only show in town because Cooks was there, but Cooks was in and out when Fuller was really at his best. And so he was very good last year for sure. But also he kind of had a little bit of the only game in town with a great quarterback thing kind of all working together for him.
Yeah, I would probably disagree with that, but we went through this last year a lot.
No, well, like I said, I think he was very good last year. He was a lot better than I thought. But if I'm just talking about Waddle and Fuller specifically, there's obviously the durability concerns with Will Fuller, that Waddle is coming off the injury in college, but we haven't seen him have the injury-plagued NFL seasons. I mean, Fuller's played 29 games in the last 3 seasons. So he's definitely had those issues. And then he's missing the first game. So it's just it kind of sucks to draft a guy. Like you said, you draft a guy and then you can't play him week 1. So
most definitely
there is that. But yeah, I think either of those guys could be a value, but really the biggest value for any of those guys on that team probably isn't coming if they stay healthy. I'll just put it that way. And then the New York Jets, kind of the opposite of a fantasy quagmire. There's just not a lot there, besides the fact that they have 2 Hall of Famers, Dalton. I mean, these rookies they have coming in, they sound pretty awesome. And Elijah Moore and Michael Carter, right? I mean, that's all I've been reading.
I thought you meant they had 2 Hall of Famers on the actual roster. I was like, I didn't know Frank Gore was still a Jet.
I mean, they've got these rookies who they're getting hyped up, and Michael Carter. I'm going to go ahead and say I am selling this take, but I just wanted to put this out there. I read something on CBS that predicted Michael Carter to be the most productive rookie running back in fantasy football this year. And you think about it, ETN, maybe you can see Javonte Williams, maybe you can see, but like Najee Harris, like we have a national outlet projecting him to outproduce Najee Harris. And I get the Michael Carter love. I mean, he and Javonte Williams were great last year. They were basically equal in yards. They were both he averaged like 8 yards a carry. Williams was like at 6 or 7. Insanely efficient. Both very good pass catchers. Both caught exactly 25 passes, which tells you that if either one of them had the backfield to themselves in college, that's probably like a 40 catch season, which is pretty insane for a 12-game college season. So he especially has has that skill set. But even with that running back room looking pretty thin, Tevin Coleman, Michael Pirine, Ty Johnson, I guess Josh Adams is still around and kicking there too. I am not buying that he's going to outproduce Najee Harris, but I am buying that and we've talked about this, I am buying that he is going to produce for your team maybe quicker than his NFL draft position would indicate.
Yeah, well, and we'll get to my take here in a minute, but I mean, that offensive line is a major upgrade from last season. Mekhi Becton, who was the left tackle last season, did really well at it. Just the rest of the offensive line was an utter disaster. They drafted Vera Tucker, who seems to be a really good swing guard and fits well in that zone rushing scheme that we think they're going to deploy since they're coming from the Shanahan coaching tree. And they just picked up that right tackle Moses from Washington, who was just a cap casualty cut, but has graded out well his last 4 seasons in the NFL. So the offensive line is going to produce. But my big takeaway was I think Zach Wilson's actually incredibly underrated in drafts right now. His BYU numbers are pretty fun to look at. I know he beat up on really bad teams, but some things you can really glean from it. He averaged 6 rushes a game when he was at BYU in his senior season and had 10 touchdowns that were rushing. So obviously we always look for the rushing upside. Zach Wilson looks to be a guy who has that. Secondly, he's just loaded with weapons. I mean, I know we like to nag on Jamison Crowder, but Jamison Crowder's been a productive wide receiver in the NFL. And then obviously Corey Davis coming off of one of the most productive seasons he's had. And Elijah Moore, who A.J. Brown said was better than him. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've quite taken that one to the bank, but yes, he is very good.
And just my deal with him is right now he's going as the quarterback 25, and Fields and Lance are going ahead of him when we don't know if Trey Lance will play this season. I think Justin Fields will play at some point, but Zach Wilson's going to play all 18 games, I'm pretty sure. And more important to that is, I mean, would you really rather have Big Ben than Zach Wilson, who at least can move with his feet and is mobile and probably has a better offensive line? I don't think that Zach Wilson's ADP quite matches how he should be treated as a prospect. I think we're underrated the 2nd overall pick in the draft.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the only scenario where I would be drafting him is if you're like in a pretty deep league, you have an established quarterback, and you just instead of drafting a guy who you can easily pick up a guy of that same quality as a streamer, just take a shot on the young kid and see what happens. If you don't have that roster flexibility, though, I'm probably just rolling with one quarterback like usual, and definitely not drafting him as the starter. But if you can't draft him, he's just a guy to kind of keep your eye on, I guess, and see what happens. I do agree.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really my take here is I think he just deserves to be at least in the teens at this point.
Yeah, and then the Patriots. So if there was any team who was more difficult to talk about than the Jets, it's probably the Patriots. And the best I can do is talk about their tight ends, which is just an incredibly fun conversation. Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith, we were excited. Whichever one of those guys signed first, and then the other one came, and it was kind of sadness all around. It's going to be, I think, really good for real football for the Patriots. Belichick has already said plenty about how he's excited for Jonnu Smith to be able to chip pass rushers and get out on the edge. It's like, well,
God, there's so many fantasy points in chipping pass rushers.
As much as I say that you want your guy to be able to do all that to stay on the field, you don't want the coach to be talking about that's what he's excited for that player to do. Now it's Bill Belichick, so you never know what you can actually believe. But really the question when you look at the Patriots is, can either of those guys be fantasy relevant since they're both on the same team? And I think my answer to that is no. That's, of course, barring injury, which with Hunter Henry, you're going to deal with. He's already had a lower leg injury in camp. Don't really know how serious, but it didn't seem very serious. But just an every year thing with him. But I don't know. You look at Cam Newton. I will say, if you want any kind of optimism, there is that the 2 tight end thing and the short routes, and especially short routes in between the numbers, that's about one of the only things that Cam does well at this point is make those throws. And both those guys were ranked 90 or higher by PFF and catching passes between 0 and 20 yards, 0 and 9, and 11 and 19. In 2020, Cam completed about 75% of his throws between the numbers in that range, which think about how bad he was last year and how many passes were thrown in the dirt. So again, like the one thing he did well, but I just think with 2 tight ends in an offense that I don't see being much more productive than last year, it was in the teens, I think. Yeah, 12 passing touchdowns last year. I think Kendrick Bourne had 2, and like that was like a highlight when you look at their stat sheet. It was bad. Not expecting it to be a whole lot better. They're going to run the ball. They're going to want to play defense to win games. I'm not drafting anybody but Damian Harris on that offense, I don't think. Maybe like Kendrick Bourne very late. And I'm not excited about anybody on this team, quite frankly.
Yeah, so we had similar takeaways here, so I don't waste too much time. But I don't even think this is a hot take, but I said New England won't have a tight end finish in the top 12 and a wide receiver finish in the top 24 by the end of the season.
I think that's just correct. Yeah.
I think we're also going to deal with something very unfriendly to fantasy managers, which is going to be a midseason QB change. I'm pretty sure Cam Newton plays 7 or 8 games, and maybe after the bye, considering where they're at, we see Mac Jones come in, and we talked about it last week. Rookie quarterbacks have trouble, having one top 12 to top 24 receiving option, and it's just so bad in New England. I think fantasy Twitter's been hyping up Jacoby Myers as a sleeper. Like, it's just it's not pretty there, and I agree with you. Damian Harris and Nelson Aguilar, maybe late are the only 2 players.
Yeah, I guess Aguilar too.
I would consider taking. And then, I mean, I saw some good stuff about Ramondre Stevenson, but he looks like a LeGarrette Blount 2.0. So it's just there's not a lot to be excited about here fantasy-wise, and I'm staying away as much as possible.
Yeah, so we spent 3:30 on the Patriots. That's probably about 3 minutes too long, quite frankly. The Bengals, I mentioned it at the top. Joe Mixon. It's kind of Joe Mixon day, Joe Mixon season all over Twitter. The Joe Mixon hype train is leaving the station, and Dalton, I think I'm getting on it. I think he can have the best season of his career this year. He's always been good. Go ahead. It looks like you want to say something.
I'm just saying we were here last year, and it's unfair.
I was on the Joe Mixon bandwagon.
He only played 6 games, though. He only played 6 games. What can you do?
I'm saying the 3 of us were on this hype train last year, and we rode it. And
I know.
And now everybody
I was about
else
to buy a Bengals jersey. Like, I was that committed to Mixon, and then I'm ready to be hurt again.
I know. Like, he got hurt. His coach lied to us a lot, and we just both had him on our benches, Johnny, for the whole rest of the season while we waited for him to come back off the IR. But he's pretty much always good when healthy. Week to week, it's not always been consistent, and that is mainly the situation. That's not anything to do with him. I think it's not a hot take at all to say he's been a way better NFL player than fantasy football player so far in his career, and he's been pretty good for fantasy football.
I mean, I do like that Giovanni Bernard's not there anymore.
Yep.
But a new player has emerged, Puka Williams. Ever heard of him?
I thought you were gonna say Captain America, because Captain America is also in the backfield. But when you look back, he's had stretches like 2018, those last 5 games. I mean, Dalton, we talked about what Barkley did to end that season. Like, Mixon was right there production-wise. And even in that season, he has 1,200 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, 300 receiving. He was the RB11 and then the RB9 in points per game. But actually, it was 2019. So the next year, over the last 5 weeks, he's the RB5 in the last 5 weeks of the fantasy season, 132 scrimmage yards per game. And just when things are actually like right in that offense, he has top 5 upside every time he steps on the field. He's got absolutely nobody to threaten his workload, and he's just an awesome player. And he's never reached double-digit touchdowns before. Again, a lot more to do with the Bengals than him. He's 6'1", 220. There is literally no reason why he cannot reach double-digit touchdowns if given the opportunity. He was already seeing a less stacked box last year when he played than the years before, thanks to Joe Burrow, evading 6.4 tacklers per game in 2019 compared to last year, down to 4.7. And now he's got hopefully a little bit of a better offensive line. He's got Jamar Chase. I'm taking Joe Mixon to the bank this year.
Yeah, I love Joe Mixon. We've talked about him a lot. I mean, if he gets that every down back, stops letting Gio cut into those passes, and Gio's no longer there.
Mhm.
Very, very high upside. I think this Cincinnati Bengals team is going to score a lot of points. One, because I think their defense is bad. They even lost their best player on defense, which was Carl Lawson. Now they have as a good safety. And it's just going to benefit them a lot. And I think Joe Mixon's not going to leave the field too often because their running backs get pretty thin right after.
Yeah, like Samaje Perine might come in like every now and then. And maybe Chris Evans will catch maybe like 20, 25 passes. And that's probably about it for the other guys on that team.
Yeah. My big takeaway here, though, I think we are underrating Jamar Chase, which at first I thought was crazy. But I just looked at his ADP and I kind of looked around. His college season's off the charts. It's never happened before. And he did that in a very high-profile LSU offense.
Well, to be fair, it actually did happen the following year with Devonta Smith. But
It
before
did,
that,
yes.
it had never
But before
happened.
that, it had never happened. And he's on a team, like I just said, they're going to throw a lot. Last year, they were the highest team above pass rate expectation when they had Joe Burrow. That beats out the Bills, who we know passed an absurd amount of times. So the passing is there. There's obviously a locker room narrative. And Jamar Chase is just so good. I can't see why you're not going to take him there at the 4th round where he's going in drafts right now. I mean, there are some names around him that are exciting, but there's also people like Chase Claypool has gone around him I've seen in drafts. And DJ Moore is there too. But I just get more excited about it. We saw Burrow has
I would take DJ Moore over him for sure, I think.
See, I would take Jamar Chase at this point after doing my research. I just think Jamar Chase I think he could easily beat Justin Jefferson's 1,400 receiving yards mark last season.
That's a lot. I don't know. I mean, obviously, yes, they were on the same college team, and we know who actually led that team production-wise. It was Jamar Chase, so he's a stud for sure. He's also, I mean, not that Adam Thielen's not great, and Dalvin Cook, but like T. Higgins is really awesome too. And it's possible that Jamar Chase could have a very good season and not even be the top receiver from a fantasy perspective on his own team. But I am overall with you that I think it's funny because we've kind of been in the dynasty bubble, and his ranking obviously is through the roof in dynasty, right? But in redraft, I've been a little bit surprised, like you said, with his value. But yeah, the T. Higgins thing I think is at least a real factor there.
Well, right now he's between Robbie Anderson and Brandon Cooks in ADP, which I think, at least among those two, I'd rather have him. I don't know.
Yeah.
Jamar Chase's over-under for receiving yards is 1,025 receiving yards.
Well, Dalton, you have to slam the over.
Yeah,
I'll slam
if
the
you
over.
go to the bank, get a mortgage loan, just put $400K on it.
What did Justin Jefferson have? Wasn't it like 1,400 yards?
He had over 1,400. He broke the record.
Yeah, you literally, to have your word carry any weight ever again, you have to bet that after what you just said.
I would love to, but betting is illegal in the state of Kansas.
Okay. The Cleveland Browns. Dalton, I had a tough time deciding what on earth to talk about with the Browns. I mean, we know Chubb is a stud. We know Kareem Hunt is going to go as like the RB 18 to 26-ish in every draft with that upside. I think the thing you've got to look at still is Odell on that team. And it's not like I love Odell this year. I actually think you had him ranked a little bit higher than me on our previous show. But he's the only pass catcher on that team I have any interest in drafting. I've got no interest in Austin Hooper. Jarvis Landry, I can find that production on the waiver wire anytime I want to during the season if you're in redraft. Rashad Higgins, kind of the same thing. I think just Odell, he's going in the beginning of the 6th round. I know he's only been over 100 yards 2 times with the Browns and whatever it's been, like 22, 23 games. I know that pretty much everything is down from when he was with the Giants, right? Touchdowns, his targets, efficiency, catch rate, yards per catch, everything. It's obviously not the same guy as he was in New York. He is another ACL injury now in his history. So he's got the ACL. He obviously had some problems with the broken ankle and other things in New York too. So, but I think all of that stuff is baked into the ADP. And what kind of has me coming back is Baker, after being the QB 23 pre-bye week, was QB 13 and like a streamable guy last year post bye week. And I just wonder, I don't buy into the narrative that it's just like, oh, well, Odell, he's just better without Odell. I just don't think that's the case. I think that's just the Browns kind of found themselves down the stretch just as a whole, Baker included. And if Baker can kind of be that guy again, there's a non-zero chance Odell kind of kicks that ADP, to the curb about midway through the season. We could look back and say, how was he in the 6th round? Not like a top 5 guy, but top 15, top 20, which is all he'd have to do to justify that.
Yeah, and his ADP has actually been creeping up. He's all the way up to wide receiver 25 right now, which we're starting to get into. Like, I might pump the brakes territory if he moves up much more.
Well, you have him at 20, so you should be all in still.
I know, but he's also there in part because I could get him cheap, and he's getting more expensive by the day. But I still really like him. I think the talent's still there. I agree with you. I don't think that Browns bump came from Odell getting injured. It came from the bye and them not having an offseason to practice Kevin Stefanski's offense. And I really do like Odell Beckham. I think this Browns offense is going to be a lot of the same we saw last year, but that gives a good place for Odell to score fantasy points. My big takeaway, because I wanted to punt this one and didn't really have fun with it, was to buy Donovan Peoples-Jones, Anthony Schwartz, and Rashard Higgins in Dynasty because Odell's done with his contract this year, and I don't see a situation where he's brought back just because the Browns have a lot more investments they have to make. They bought a lot of players in the offseason on defense, and Baker Mayfield is due his extension. And I think that Odell's probably going to be the casualty of that. And that means that next year there's going to be a massive bump for one of those guys to be the top pass catcher in this offense, unless they draft somebody, obviously. But it's a good, it's a good throw. It's a good deep shot.
They at least, even if they only bring in one guy, it's a little bump up the depth chart. For sure. Kind of on that same note, should Odell maybe be a buy in Dynasty then if we have hope of him going to a different team, maybe a better situation? What do you think about that?
He will be 29 in November, so he will be 30 next NFL season on that new team.
Yeah.
I don't know. For a guy known for his explosiveness, it does kind of scare me that you're getting up there when explosiveness really trails off. It would have to be what I see from him this season. And I mean, if you can trade someone a second rounder or something in a rookie draft, I might do it just because it's just a dart throw.
I don't think I'd buy right now, but it's funny. I'm saying I want to wait and see him, but I actually think if he's like not good again and is disappointing and his value is like rock bottom, I'd be looking to swoop in and get him for very cheap and hope his situation improves. And he heads to a new team. He can come be the Chiefs wide receiver too next year if he wants. He could take that Juju deal that he didn't take last year.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, he's a guy I'd trade cheap for if someone was unimpressed with him.
Okay, the Ravens, and I'm gonna keep this one pretty quick because I wanted to save J.K. Dobbins for a future show. We know I like J.K. Dobbins a lot. Still upset with Johnny for taking him away in our Dynasty League. And we've talked about Lamar plenty on this show. I think it's time to quit overlooking Lamar Jackson. He's going as, the QB3 and underdog, so very high, QB4 in Fantasy Pros. But, I just don't see why he's not the consensus quarterback 2. I don't see why it's not Lamar Jackson firmly there as the quarterback 2. I just don't get Kyler or Josh Allen ahead of him. Lamar, when he was 22, had one of the best per game fantasy seasons of all time at quarterback. The guy still is not 25 yet. We act like he's on the wrong side of his prime or something because he had kind of a rough year last year where he still rushed for over 1,000 yards, was still a top 8 quarterback. He only played 15 games too. So if he didn't miss a game and if he didn't have diarrhea in another game, perhaps he could have had slightly better numbers. But if he stays healthy, I just think we saw his floor last year. I think that's his floor going forward. He's never had double-digit rushing touchdowns. I think that's very much in the cards for any season. He could do that. And I just think he was barely over 1,000 rushing yards last year. He was 200 more than that in his MVP season. So it wasn't just the passing and the touchdown rate that fell off. it was the rushing a little bit too. And for reference, I think he's going to be somewhere in between what he was last year and his MVP season, pretty much going forward. That MVP season, he had a 9% touchdown rate. For reference, Mahomes was 8.6% his MVP season. Russell Wilson's best, which we know he's had some crazy touchdown rates, 8.2. I don't think Lamar is probably ever going to beat 9%, but he doesn't have to be like firmly that quarterback 2. He has the safest floor to me of anybody besides Mahomes, and he has probably just as much upside as Mahomes because of the rushing. And then he's got better weapons with Watkins, bringing Rashad Bateman, Tylan Wallace. So I like Lamar's outlook this year. I think he is the firm quarterback 2.
Yeah, and you and I are pretty much in consensus that we love him. We might rank him a little differently, but he definitely has that quarterback 1 ceiling. And just one thing I will say before I get on to my take, Rich Rebar over at Sharp Football Analysis did a really good article that it pretty much proved the point that rushing quarterbacks don't get injured more often than pocket passers. There's just no real reason to be concerned about Lamar Jackson's value. I think he gets dinked for that because people think because he takes hits, he's going to get hurt. But watch him run.
He really doesn't. Yeah, he doesn't take it.
He gets out of bounds. He slides. I mean, he runs smart. So I don't buy into that either. I like him. And I like him so much that this led to this take, which is that I don't think J.K. Dobbins is going to return his current value as RB15 and the overall player 26 off the board. A lot of this comes from Andrew Erickson wrote an article over at PFF about how mobile quarterbacks influence their running backs. And this little stat nugget came out of it. What's alarming is that the top 8 backs in PPR, all of them except Derrick Henry, had quarterbacks who ranked in the bottom half of the league in scramble yards. And then out of the top 20, just 5 running backs had what is considered a mobile quarterback. And out of those running backs had at least a 70% snap share. So the mobile quarterback thing obviously hurts J.K. Dobbins. But then to compound it, I still think he is going to be in at least a 60-40 snap share with Gus Edwards. Gus the Bus is a good runner. J.K. Dobbins is a great runner too, but when you're a team like the Ravens who love to run it, it doesn't hurt toting out a guy who averages 5.2 yards a carry over the last 2 seasons, and then a guy who averages over 6 yards a carry last season. And I know there's camp talk about it, but I don't see Dobbins getting more targets. He had 24 last season, and maybe they want to give him the ball more, but they also added Tylan Wallace, Rashad Bateman, and Sammy Watkins, not to mention that I think Mark Andrews is probably due for a little bit of a bounce back. Mm-hmm. And there are just so many things working against him that he's going to have like a very Nick Chubb-esque level of efficiency. And what hurts him is that Lamar Jackson is going to eat into those red zone touchdowns. There's going to be times where Gus Edwards is in the red zone, and that's really where you're going to have to make your money for him to hit that value, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to say too much here because, spoiler alert, J.K. Dobbins is definitely going to be one of my guys when we get later on into those shows. But what I will say is, think back to 2019. Ingram scores 15 touchdowns. He's the running back 8. And a lot of that was not Mark Ingram being like awesome. It's that offense. That offense, even if some of those opportunities in the red zone, in the passing game, even if they aren't there for him like they might be for other guys because of Edwards, because of Jackson, I still just think that offense is just such a high octane rushing offense that he should and did last year put up good numbers when he played. Basically, he doesn't have to have the high volume. I mean, last year he was still pretty much locked in as an RB1 type of guy, with Gus Edwards being a top 24 running back, with Lamar being there pretty much that whole way down the stretch. So I just think, number one, I think Dobbins is really awesome. Honestly, he's one of my favorite running backs in the NFL. Not one of the 5 best, but just one of my favorite to watch. I really like watching him play, and that offense is just so good. And I do think he actually has that workhorse ability to maybe eat into the Gus Edwards shares a little bit. But I've probably said too much. I want to save a little bit for when we talk about him later on.
And I'm sure we will, because I think you and I differ on him in the same way we differ on Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, well, the last year. I'm not quite as all in as Josh Jacobs this year, although I can guarantee I have him ranked higher than you do. No doubt about that. Okay, let me scroll back.
We are on the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Oh gosh,
if you want to get excited.
Yeah, so I'm actually I keep saying I'm going to make this quick, and we're going pretty long on a lot of these teams. This one I for real mean I'm actually going to be quick here. Deontay Johnson, he's the guy I'm drafting out of these receivers, and I think when you talk about the Steelers, that's the number one question, right? You've got three receivers, Deontay Johnson kind of going in the low 20s, the other two guys in the late 20s, early 30s. Who do you like at their ADP? I think it's Johnson. He's the best receiver on the team. We've talked about this, Dalton, on here, in text messages, on Twitter, wherever, that we shouldn't be dinging him for drops because all the big name guys, or a lot of the big name guys, young guys, even older guys like Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, those guys have drops too in the same neighborhood as Deontay Johnson. Here's his reception perception from Matt Harmon last year. 95th percentile versus man, 96th versus zone, 86th versus press coverage. He's just awesome at everything. He's 6th in the NFL in targets per game last year. He had 10 or more targets 10 times. That's with him like
Getting
kind of having
and getting injured twice.
Having like the Will Fuller syndrome of I'm either going to have a huge game or get hurt on the first drive like 3 times last year. And I just think with those other guys, Juju, we saw his warts last year. He's a good player, but he's best used on the inside. Doesn't have the upside of either of those other two guys as a result. Claypool, I think volume is his big problem. His touchdown rate, while I think it is always going to be high, just hard to predict and trust that from a year-to-year basis. He had 11 touchdowns last year, 4 of those in one game. So I just think
the secondary-less Eagles.
Yeah. So I just think Johnson is the best and safest of those guys.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. You don't get 150 targets in the 5th round that often, and you can this year. My takeaway is to be even more concerned about the offensive line. Of players they lost, Villanueva, who had 16 starts, Matt Failer had 13, Marquise Pouncey had 13, and David DeCastro had 13. And despite having what would be considered some of the best names in offensive line football, they were ranked 29th in the NFL. All of those guys are gone. And they added a 3rd and 4th rounder offensive lineman, one of which Braden Thorne doesn't think is NFL caliber or will ever start a snap, for what it's worth. And then they spent $3 million in the offseason to bring talent to the roster. So I am incredibly concerned that the Steelers' offensive line is going to look horrible, which by extension, I am incredibly concerned that Big Ben might have more ice packs on him than he had last season, which is hard to do. So my biggest concern is that this offense could function at a more inept level than it did last season. With that being said, the player that I am taking is Deontay Johnson, and the player I'm most worried about is likely Chase Claypool, because I think his volume comes on deep shots, and I question how many of those deep shots we'll be able to get. And then I think Najee Harris has a direct impact on Juju's low ADOT, and that's just going to make them two competing interests on who gets the ball in those short yardage throws, which all of that to say Deontay Johnson is a draft pick, and everything else is probably not going to be fun to watch. There's no 11-0 team out of the Steelers team.
Yeah, no, and there shouldn't have been last year. Last thing I'll say is Najee Harris, we've talked about him a little bit. I think you are really, really, really going to have to just trust the volume. And even if it's not efficient volume, which it probably won't be, it's probably going to be a top 20 season. But if that volume goes away, there's still downside that I think we have to acknowledge. But it should be a high volume, low efficiency season. But you'll take it in fantasy. But it's not the prettiest.
Can't wait until Kalen Ballage takes over the starting role.
The Indianapolis Colts, Carson Wentz. Dalton, does he improve, hurt, or keep this offense the same as it was last season? And I think my take is he will keep it about the same for real life football. For fantasy, I think he will improve it just a tiny, tiny bit. And mainly what I think will improve is the weekly upside. Like Phillip Rivers was actually pretty consistent last year, but there wasn't a lot of week-to-week upside for anybody besides pretty much Jonathan Taylor late in the season. And just when you look at Wentz versus Rivers last year, so Wentz's average time in the pocket per drop back was 2.89 seconds, 23rd among qualifiers, among 29 qualifiers in that stat, almost half a second higher than Phillip Rivers. Basically, what that means to me is less running back dump offs, less tight end dump offs, less short stuff to the receivers. Maybe we get some T.Y. Hilton down the field. I kind of can get into, I don't even, oh, good Lord. I don't even have his name in front of me now. Preston. No, not Preston. What's his name?
Michael Pittman.
Nope, not Michael Pittman. Not Michael
Paris
Pittman.
Campbell.
Paris Campbell. I said Preston Williams. I can kind of dig Paris Campbell as like a almost undrafted sleeper a little bit because I think you could maybe see the return of the deep ball in Indy. But just from a pure production standpoint, I don't see a whole lot of difference besides that you could actually justify one of these guys in DraftKings and they could maybe blow up. That's about it on this team for me.
I like that you said that they're pretty comparable because 2020 Phillip Rivers had a 7.7 yards per attempt, and 2017 MVP Frank Reich coach Carson Wentz had a 7.5 yards per attempt. They had very similar PFF ratings, both in the 80s. The only big difference between them is the big time throw rate. Carson Wentz had a 6.4 and Phillip Rivers was a 5%. But Carson Wentz took 9 more sacks, which is what happens when you hold the ball longer, obviously. So I think they are pretty similar in a lot of ways. And I think we're going to see a lot of the same, except, and I agree with you, the dump offs, which probably hurt some of the running back volume we saw last season. And my takeaway is I don't want any pass catchers who are being drafted on this team. Pretty similar to yours. I would agree. Paris Campbell is a fun deep round dart throw because of one healthy game he had last season. He had 9 targets, 64 yards, almost had a touchdown. Was by far the best player on the field. Matt Harmon at reception perception absolutely grilled Michael Pittman for having a horrific season that hardly survived alone on volume. He had one game where he had 9 targets, 2 catches, and 10 yards. It's very hard to do that. It's very AJ Green-esque, except he's 22, not 30. So, yeah, I agree. Overall, I'm not excited about the Colts. Jonathan Taylor is probably the only fun player to talk about here, and the other ones are just dart throws.
Yep, and if you're thinking about Wentz as like a fantasy option himself, I think around, if he can get back to his 2019, which was 4,000 yards, 27 touchdowns, 7 picks, I think the combination of good coaching, good talent, and better offensive line play can actually get him back to around those numbers, and he's got some rushing upside on a week-to-week basis. So he's at least like a streamer to watch, not a guy you're drafting, but a streamer to watch.
They do play the Texans in December during fantasy playoffs. So
if you're looking really far ahead, Carson Wentz for your playoffs.
Yeah. So there you go. There's why you would take Carson Wentz, is to hold him till December.
The Jaguars, Dalton. This one short and sweet. James Robinson. I don't make a do not draft list. If I did, he would be on it. Nothing has really changed from the NFL draft. I know we've had all kinds of smoke blown up our butts by the Jags coaches about a lot of different players, including I think they just came out and said, oh, well, James Robinson's going to be the goal line guy, going to have the chance to do that. It's like, I really don't care what they say. It doesn't change my opinion of what I think is going to happen.
Well, Trevor Lawrence also hasn't earned the starting job. Just taking their blurbs.
Color me skeptical. I think if you draft James Robinson, he's immediately the number one thing you're stressed out about your team, like almost no matter who else you draft. So number one, I just don't want that, period. I just don't want to have to deal with that. I think he's going to start the season. I think he'll probably have some decent games, and you are immediately going to be trying to sell him to a league, if you're in a smart league, full of people who know that it could be a ticking time bomb with ETN potentially looming for a larger workload later in the season. I just want no part of it. I don't see the upside unless there is an ETN injury.
Yeah. James' RB1 season lasted all about 2 months for me. So that sucked, but I agree with you. I wouldn't take him. It's a headache. People are also forgetting Carlos Hyde is there, and Carlos Hyde is this like goal line back now. That's why I think he'll be in Urban Meyer's offense. And he can't underestimate, he played at Ohio State under Urban Meyer, which I don't like narrative street, but it's Urban Meyer. So just putting that out there for people to keep in mind. And for everything he did last season, James Robinson was volume driven for fantasy purposes, and he's just not going to have that. My big takeaway is I'm staking a flag on it. I take Chenault over Chark every time. Wide
Wow.
receiver 48 for Chenault, wide receiver 30 for Shark. Last season, per route run, DJ Chark had a lower target percentage. He was at 19. Chenault was 19.6. Obviously, Chenault ran fewer routes. But what really is great, and I think you even said this last time, is that when it comes to his PFF grade against man coverage, Chenault was an 84.6, which in their rookie season compares to Justin Jefferson, Michael Thomas, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Terry McLaurin, A.J. Brown, and Stephon Diggs. Those are the other players who have done it and had it that high. I think he's a great talent, and if they don't use him as a gadget player and they just put him out wide, he's going to be great. And I think Chark is on the bad side of Urban Meyer already. And I think
another blurb, by the way, that we talked about. Well, Chark, but also Chenault going to be used more as a pure wide receiver this year.
A lot of blurbs coming out of there, but one I do take. I mean, last season people were in on Chenault because he's a great prospect, and I think I think it's just a good time to get him cheaper before he goes up in price.
If you're just talking about season long, I do have some concerns with Marvin Jones. If Marvin Jones wasn't there, I think I'd feel better about Chenault. Chark can kind of be the pure deep threat guy. I think Chenault and Marvin Jones, I think, are going to overlap a little bit more in what they do. So I think that does kind of maybe not hurt the upside, but just the consistency probably isn't going to be there like it could be if that role was kind of all Chenault. But I'm with you that long term, especially, I'm a fan of Chenault, and he's a guy that he is probably one of everyone's favorite dart throws kind of in the middle of drafts there because he's got the upside for sure.
Absolutely. With bad defense, good quarterbacking, he has what he needs to do. And he showed off on the metrics, not on the stat line as much. He was wide receiver 12 the last 2 games, but that's a very small sample size to pull anything out of.
I will say DJ Chark was a top 20 wide receiver 2 years ago. So we at least have seen him do it. And I'm not ready to completely count him out just yet. And I think I would take Chark this year. Long term, that could be a different discussion though.
Yeah, I think I would be willing to say Chenault finishes better than Chark at the end of the season. Injuries notwithstanding.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. I'll take that bet, Johnny. You have your first bet. You can write down DJ Chark. I'm saying DJ Chark finishes as the higher ranked guy. Dalton says Laviska Shenault.
That's funny because you own Chenault in our Dynasty League.
Yeah. But remember, Dynasty, not just about this year. Not just about this year. The Texans, a team that really should be thinking about a lot more than just this year. Dalton, is there even a fantasy relevant player on this roster?
This is the oldest roster in the NFL.
And maybe the worst.
Easily, they should be. If there was relegation in the NFL, Alabama should be the 32nd team, not the Houston Texans. Draft Brandon Cooks in the 9th round and stop there because he's the only guy that's startable on that team. Don't get cute. Don't draft Nico Collins. Don't draft Kiki QT.
You're going to love what I have to say here then. I think David Johnson could be a little bit of a value. Little bit of a value. He's going as like the running back 43 on Underdog right now.
No, but is Philip Lindsay going to get some Mark Ingram, Rex Burkhead? There's just so many backs in that locker room that I just don't even know who to expect to run the ball.
Well, number one, I can guarantee you all 4 of those backs will not make the team. Like Mark Ingram does not play special teams, so it's going to be him or Burkhead. Or there's one guy that's on the outs there, but obviously completely different situation this year to last year. But David Johnson, for like as uninspiring as it was, and it was uninspiring, no doubt about it. He was the RB22 last year, and if you take it out to all 17 games, he was the RB19. I think the workload's probably going to be there. It's not going to be very efficient. It's probably not going to be a ton of scoring opportunities. He probably will get a lot of targets, though, because he kind of was back to catching a lot of passes like David Johnson does last year. Look, I'm not saying like you take him, you start him, you don't look back. But what I'm saying is if you could take him as like your RB like 4, I think like that, it's not like I don't feel like he's an anchor on my roster because if it goes bad in Houston, it could go really bad. And you've got to be okay with releasing him if you're going to take him. But there could be a little bit of value there, kind of similar to Zach Moss, I think.
I guess You could say I'm sorry. They ranked 14th in the NFL in scoring offense with like arguably the third or fourth best quarterback in the NFL last year, and I just have such low expectations.
I just want you to know. I'm looking at your rankings from when we did our ranking show, so maybe you've updated them since. You have David Johnson 2 spots higher than me.
That's getting fixed.
You have him at 33.
Michael Carter.
You have him ahead of James Robinson.
Okay, to be fair, I'd probably, if I had to really, really like nail it down and pick one, I'd probably take David Johnson. But
you have Michael Carter down at 40. You have Michael Carter below him.
He's getting moved above David Johnson.
Okay, not much more time should be spent there, but just a thought. Not a fun pick. No one's gonna say, "Oh man, he got David Johnson in the 8th round." Like, wow. But hey, those picks, if they win you 1 week, that's all it takes for that pick to pay off.
God, David Johnson was the number 1 overall like 4 years ago.
Yeah, and then broke his wrist like 80 seconds into the season. Yeah. It's been downhill pretty much ever since then. The Titans, I think the question that we have to talk about, because we haven't really yet, is how does Julio Jones integrate into this offense? Is that what you had, Dalton, or do you have something different?
In a way, my takeaway is that I think you should draft Ryan Tannehill as a top 12 quarterback.
Okay.
But because of Julio Jones is mainly what the argument boils down to.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really, really hard to say, because you have 2 of the, I would say, probably top 20 real life NFL receivers on the same team. That team does not really like to throw that much. They throw a little bit and they do it very efficiently, but they don't generally make their money by throwing the ball 40, 45 times a game, like a lot of teams in the NFL. I don't know, like, is Derrick Henry too high at 6? Do we think they're going to throw the ball a little bit more? And when I say 6, I mean running back 6 for me. He's higher than that for a lot of people, probably. I don't know what to expect, other than I think you're drafting Julio as a top 20 for sure, maybe top 15 type of guy. A.J. Brown, top 10. A.J. Brown no longer has the number 1 overall receiver upside that he had before, but can still have a very great season. The last thing I will say, though, is Julio Jones was the wide receiver 4 in 2019, not last year, but 2019. So, like, we have to be prepared maybe for a world where he ends up being the best fantasy player on that team, or at least the receiver. It could happen. And I don't know what to make of it, other than it really comes down to us, with them more than almost anybody, the direction they take their offense. Are they going to throw more? Are they still going to be hard and heavy as far as the running game goes?
So I think that if everything falls into place, Ryan Tannehill could finish within the top 6 of quarterbacks, which means he replaces someone like Dak or Kyler Murray or Lamar. And the reason
he can replace Dak, that'd be fine by me.
The reason I think that is we can look at the stat. We have very, very clear on-off stats with Julio Jones and Matt Ryan, and it's like a 50-yard per game difference, like a 6-point, 7-point difference in scoring. Efficiency goes up. Everything goes up for Matt Ryan. And Ryan Tannehill last season was top 3 in fantasy points for dropback. He was only behind Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers, right in front of Josh Allen and Kyler Murray. The only reason he didn't score more points was exactly what you talked about. They run the ball a lot. Mm-hmm. This is me following just kind of the line of thought you and I have had the last couple of years, is that Derrick Henry is going to break down. I mean, it's going to happen. If he breaks down. I
just don't know if it happens this year, though. Maybe it's just because it's kind of the nice thing to say when you talk about him in Dynasty, but I just think he's got one more great year, and then that might be it.
I know, but 2 straight 300-plus carry seasons, it just, either he gets scaled back a little bit, or if he breaks down, there's no one on the team who can do that. I mean, there's not a player in the NFL who can do that, to be quite honest.
I mean, their backup running back last year was Darrington Evans. Is he still their backup running back? What, do he have, like 5 touches last year?
And you combine that with their defense probably taking a step back. Their biggest free agent signing was Bud Dupree, who's not going to start the season because of an ACL tear. And they were one of the, by the hair of their teeth, they stayed close into games where they could run the ball. If that doesn't happen and the points get out of hand, they're down 21, they have to pass more. And Tannehill's just been an efficient passer especially for a guy who played wide receiver 1 year in college. So I just think that if you're at the end of drafts and you haven't taken a guy, Tannehill's usually there. I think he's a really good shot at a guy who can finish as a top 12 QB and more than likely a top 6 if some things fall your way. And so I just like him as a very late dart throw.
Yeah, so I'm looking at my rankings right now, which, again, I haven't updated since we did our show last time. I had him at 13. I'll move him ahead of Lawrence and Stafford for sure. Probably ahead of Burrow even, too. He's going to be right there, like in that Tom Brady range for me, like in the 8-9.
I think that's a really good range. I'd probably agree with that.
8-9 area. And, yeah, he's got the upside. And just for that whole offense, I am so curious to see what their approach is to this season, because just from a longevity, if for their window to compete, what would be best for them is to not run Derrick Henry completely into the ground this year if they want to be competing for the playoffs and for Super Bowls the next 2-3 seasons. But we shall see.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully they don't, especially because I own Julio Jones. But
okay, the AFC West, the Denver Broncos, always one of our favorite teams to talk about. The Denver Broncos and Drew Lock. The Broncos pass catcher I want at his price is Cortland Sutton. There we go.
Yeah.
Do we have is Cortland Sutton your take too? Or?
Yes, we have the same take. You can go first, though.
Okay, I was Cortland Sutton. Before last year, the guy hadn't missed a game since 2014, which is his freshman year of college. So durability really hadn't been a concern. He had the shoulder issue, I believe it was, in training camp, and then unfortunately blows out his knee almost right away, like week 1 or week 2. But you can't really tag him injury prone, I guess, at this time. In 2019, he's a top 20 receiver, even with Drew Lock as his quarterback. I know the weapons around him weren't as good, but you're not drafting him to be that. You're drafting him as like the wide receiver 30. We're off the board. I think he's 29 right now, if I'm not mistaken. Not as that top 20 guy that he's already proven he has the capability of being. And then when you look at the ADP, he is mid-7th. Noah Fant is the end of the 7th, and Judy is toward the end of the 8th. I just think that Sutton, okay, he might have a volume problem. They all might have a volume problem because they all have a Drew Lock problem. There could be some major issues there as far as red zone opportunity, offensive production, just as a unit, all of that stuff. But you know what's a bad quarterback's best friend? A 6'4" contested catch freak who can go snatch interceptions from the jaws of defenders like Cortland Sutton did in 2019. And I think he's the most likely guy on that team to lead them in touchdowns. Therefore, he has the most upside of any of those 3 guys, especially Judy, who, while we both agree is a very good player, he's going to be in the slot, which will help him from a real life perspective because he had to play outside last year and he wasn't ready for that, I don't think. But from just an upside perspective in a potentially low volume situation, I'll take the outside guy who I think has a good chance to lead the team in touchdowns.
Yeah, I have Cortland Sutton, current ADP as a wide receiver 32. For some reason, we're acting like last season when he was going at the 3-4 turn. It's just an anomaly, even though he didn't play a snap. He had 1,112 yards and 6 touchdowns with Drew Lock, Joe Flacco, and Brandon Allen.
Joe Flacco.
Yeah, none of those, I think we would all agree, are starting caliber NFL talent.
Well, he was like making catches that were like making the rounds. Like I remember he had, I can't remember who it was against, but one of the best touchdown catches of the season. Anybody who watches football probably remembers at least the play in 2019. So he's just a good player.
Well, he made us think Drew Lock was good for a period of time too. So let's slow our roll a little bit here. Teddy Bridgewater, I've said it before, he had 3 top 32 wide receivers. He could easily support Cortland Sutton. I'm living under the assumption that Drew Lock does not see an NFL field again, and hopefully it's Teddy there because Teddy is willing to throw those contested, but he's very accurate contested balls, and Cortland Sutton's the benefactor of those, and he's just the best player on the team. No disrespect to Judy, but Cortland Sutton's done it in the NFL already, and Judy hasn't in a situation last year where he had almost no competition towards the end of the season. He couldn't do it. And Cortland Sutton's done it. It's just that's my big difference maker.
Yeah. You're right. I did say Locke. I should have acknowledged Bridgewater. I do still think that Locke is going to get a one last chance at some point this year, whether that is to start the season or whether that is Denver is 3-7 and they're like, okay, it's time to see once and for all if Drew Lock should be on this team next season.
As a Chiefs fan, I can't wait to watch it again. It's horrific every time.
The Chargers, one of the more fun teams after a great offseason, adding offensive linemen. Herbert is just amazing. They've got great weapons. I hate that I have to do this. I don't feel great about Austin Eckler compared to where everybody else has him, Dalton. I see people talk about him in the same breath as Alvin Kamara, and I do not love it. Wolf of Roto Street on Twitter tweeted yesterday that he'd take Eckler over any sophomore running back in redraft. That's over Jonathan Taylor. That's over Cam Akers. That's over Antonio Gibson. That's over CEH, J.K. Dobbins. That's over a lot of guys that I just think have more upside than Eckler. Eckler could easily finish ahead of a lot of those guys. He just doesn't have, I don't think, the upside they do. He was the RB8 in 2019. I think we're going to look back not as an anomaly, but I think that's going to be the best season of his career. Just the rushing touchdowns, or just the touchdowns in general, is a major concern with him. Volume, not necessarily. I mean, he got around 16 touches per game, which was right around Alvin Kamara last year. The problem is he's just not that guy to go with the viral TikTok. The viral video. He's just not that guy. He's not as good as Alvin Kamara. He is not going to turn that kind of volume, and the lack of volume inside the 5-yard line. He only had 2 carries inside the 5 last season. He had 8 rushing touchdowns once in his career season, but then he had 3 or less every other year. He had 1 last year in 10 games. The rushing touchdowns thing just scares me because, especially with him, the passing touchdowns are hard to predict because he does catch a lot of passes. They're almost a majority of them are out of the backfield. It's not like he is going out wide like some running backs do, because he's not that big a guy. You know, he's 5'11", 200 pounds. He's a very good player. I just think if we're talking about him as like a top 8 guy, top 10 guy, we're getting a little bit carried away. I have him ranked 16th. I'll probably move him up, maybe even a spot or 2. I just have to be a little bit of a wet blanket here and say I'm not taking him as a top 10 running back this season.
Yeah, we feel very differently. I have him as the RB11 right now. The only sophomore, just to reference the tweet, the only sophomore backs I have over him are Taylor and Akers. Akers by 1 and Taylor by 3. I know you say like he's no Alvin Kamara, but over the last 2 seasons, his PFF receiving grade, is the highest among any qualified back. That includes Kamara and CMC.
Yes, but okay, here's the difference. Alvin Kamara, how many rushing touchdowns did he have in the last game last year? 4?
Well, I'll get there because
was it 4? Was it 4 though? Isn't that right?
Yes.
That's more than Austin Eckler has had in every season but 1 in his career.
Absolutely. And when you have Anthony Lynn subbing out Eckler at the goal line to put in Justin Jackson, and I don't know the other names of the backs that got the Chargers goal line work. But when
years before that, Melvin Gordon. But yes, last year, Kalen Ballage, Joshua Kelly.
When you're putting those guys, and Joshua Kelly was straight up splitting reps for most of the season with Eckler for no good reason, because I think there was a game where Kelly fumbled twice and still had like 16 carries. There were very questionable decisions, and I think that Eckler is set up this season to be – there's no back behind him who I think is as qualified and skilled as him. No, I agree with you that he's not the best rusher, but the massive improvements offensive line. Corey Linsley was amazing at center last year, and then adding in Darisaw, or was it Darisaw they drafted?
Yeah.
Adding Darisaw. And then I just think that the Chargers offense is very exciting, and Eckler could be the 3rd receiving option. And those things are what excite me and make me think he has a good upside.
It's just really hard to be that elite of a running back when you don't get those touchdowns.
Kamara had 6 touchdowns, by the way.
6 touchdowns.
Not 4.
So if you take Austin Eckler, because I think it was 3, 8, 1. Those are his rushing touchdown seasons. So he's basically equaled Eckler's other years besides his one career year in that one game.
But other than last year, was he ever the starting back in his offense? I don't think he was. He was.
Well, no, but that wasn't even his
best.
best. But he only had one rushing touchdown in 10 games last year.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you're running with Anthony Lynn. You play
okay,
10 games.
If you have concerns with like DeAndre Swift and his, I mean, he had a lot of touchdowns last year just in general. Like, what's the difference between the DeAndre Swift and CEH and like guys of that size and Austin Eckler and like?
Well, my CEH take is a bad offensive line, and I'd probably give it similar to the Eckler take. Is a bad offensive line results in a lower quality of red zone touches and a bigger inability.
But they were definitely inside the 5-yard line a fair amount of times. I'd have to go look at the full splits, but he only had 2 touches, two carries inside the 5.
I mean, one example I can give you, and I know this is one of the one carries he got, was when they had to walk the ball down the field in the 2-minute drill, and then instead of calling a pass play with 3 seconds left, Anthony Lynn called a rush up the middle with Eckler. I mean, that's just an example.
And that's one of his carries, and he was probably only in because it was a 2-minute drill.
Exactly. And I think my point is that Joe Lombardi is going to utilize him a lot more in the red zone and a lot less.
And he might get more rushes, but I think it's a big step to say he's gonna have 10 rushing touchdowns. I think he would need 8 to 10 rushing touchdowns. And I know he had the 8 rushing touchdown season the one time. I just don't think that's in his skill set consistently. I can't predict that he's going to do that. Could he? Yeah. Would I predict that? No.
See, I think the value he has is that he's going to be getting a lot of catches out of the backfield.
For sure.
Such a skilled catcher that you can give him that upside in
for sure.
Top 12 rankings.
I think that workload where you talk about a guy who is awesome between the 20s, can catch some touchdowns, and maybe he'll rush for 5-6 rushing touchdowns. That'd be a pretty good season, his second best of his career. But I think all of that to me adds up to a top 16 running back, not a RB1, and definitely not I'm taking him over Cam Akers and Jonathan Taylor, or even Antonio Gibson.
I would take him over Gibson out of all those guys. If we were to argue, I would say that Eckler is positive touchdown regression and Gibson's do negative touchdown regression.
But we've talked about Gibson. I think it's very possible Eckler finishes higher than him. But if we're talking about drafting, so you don't always draft based on just who I think is going to finish one spot high. It's about team construction. It's about upside. It's fair to say I think Antonio Gibson has higher upside than Austin Eckler.
I think I still might disagree with you.
I
think they have very similar upside where both players.
Well, here's the easy bet then. Not with those two, but just Austin Eckler, top 12 running back. I say no, you say yes.
Yeah, I'll take that.
All right. All right. Second bet, Johnny. I think we can move off the Chargers. We definitely went over, but again.
Wait, what was that? What was that bet again? Eckler versus who?
Eckler top 12 or not.
Yeah, top 12 or not. Okay. I say no. Dalton says yes.
I just want to say my take was Mike Williams is really good and you should draft him as much as possible. Okay.
You can talk more about Mike Williams if you want, because we could be pretty quick, I think, with the next two if we want to.
No, there's not a lot to say. He has the highest ADOT of any receiver over 3 years, and there's a better offensive line, so he'll catch more deep balls, and he's in a contract year, so take him.
Yeah, I just want to see him
not get injured.
I just want to see him not slam into the ground butt first or back first or neck first 5 times a game. That'd be very helpful for his long-term fantasy outlook for sure. The Chiefs, and I mean, it's got to be Mecole Hardman because we know all of the rest, right? We know Tyreek Hill, we know Travis Kelce, Mahomes. There's a little bit of discussion to be had about CEH, but we talk about him enough here. I didn't figure we needed to do that again. Can Mecole Hardman finally be a fantasy starter this season, Dalton? Is that what you're going to talk about too, or do you have something else to get to?
I could have just went to last year and copy and pasted my notes for Mecole. Buy him. I think he's a wide receiver 60 right now. Being Patrick Mahomes' number 2 or 3 option, he is top 24 upside. It's very rare you can say that for guys that low. He only played 1 full year at wide receiver at Georgia. He was special teams. The other 2 years, also kind of sort of defensive back. There's some disputes amongst people whether or not he was. But there are very, very exciting things that happened last season. He had a 40% increase in target rate per route run last season. It doesn't mean his targets went up by 40%. It means every time he ran a route, he was more likely to be targeted 40% more often than last season. And he still has the highest passer rating when targeting the NFL over 2 straight seasons, beating out A.J. Brown. Granted, there's a lot less targets there. And he's second in the NFL since coming in yards after the catch per reception. Those are very, very good stats. There are people in the fantasy community who like to talk about that they can watch tape and point out that Mecole Hardman makes mistakes. Well, you're competing with Demarcus Robinson and Byron Pringle, who have made a litany of mistakes on the field. And I, as a Chiefs fan, watch it pretty often. I think those two have some of the more horrendous drops and questionable route running. And some of Mecole's mistakes come because he's asked to run more complicated plays because of the skill set he has.
Well, he's always been a little bit of a clunky fit because he was drafted. Obviously, we all remember he was drafted when things with Tyreek Hill were uncertain at best on whether or not he was going to be in the NFL again, period, and especially on the Chiefs. So he's always been a little bit of a clunky fit in that Hill can do a lot of things that he can't, but their best skills overlap, which in an ideal world, I don't think the Chiefs would have spent a second-round pick on a guy who does what his best skill is also Tyreek Hill's best skill. But what I will say about Hardman is that I know Watkins was banged up last year. You know, when is he not? But Hardman actually did lead the non-Hill Kelsey guys in receptions last year. It wasn't by much, or in targets rather. It wasn't by much, but he did. So, and they didn't go out and add any receivers. You know, they tried. They tried to add Juju. I'm sure they were in on other veteran receivers. But it just didn't work out. They add Noah Gray, who I do think 2 tight end could be a thing for the Chiefs a little bit more this year. Dalton, I told you guys, I heard the stat from Nate Taylor, 900 passing yards, 9 touchdowns, no picks from Mahomes last year in 2 tight end sets. So I think maybe that could be their kind of fake wide receiver 2 a little bit, is adding that tight end. But you've got all of the positivity about Mecole Hardman coming out pretty much every day because the Chiefs need him to step up and have the best year of his career. I do think he's going to have the best season of his career. I think he is going to be worthy of starter consideration on rosters. What I will say, just based on his role and the type of routes he'll be running, it's not going to be a smooth ride. It's not going to be like a guy you can consistently count on week in, week out. It's going to be blow up weeks, bad weeks, blow up weeks, bad weeks. But he is a guy who I would, again, be looking at to get on my fantasy team.
The only other thing I'll say about this, and this is not to disparage our former wide receivers coach who left, but there is a new wide receiver coach in Kansas City, and our former wide receiver coach has a list of names underneath him who did not live up to expectations, whether it be Byron Pringle, Demarcus Robinson, Sammy Watkins, and even Mecole. And there maybe a change is just going to be a good thing for the wide receiver room in general. And there might be some changes in how Mecole's coached. That might be part of the positive camp reporting. And that's leading very, very far to the leaves on this team. But I think a lot of the advanced stats support that Mecole could be good. And now he just has to do it on the field.
Mm-hmm. Real quick, the Raiders. Which wide receiver are we targeting late in drafts with the Raiders? You've got John Brown, you've got Henry Ruggs, you've got Bryan Edwards. You know, Gruden said he wants to get Ruggs more involved. If only Gruden knew the guy who could have got Ruggs the ball more last year, who could have targeted him more than 4 times per game last year. If only that could have happened. If only John Gruden could have told somebody. I think I'm taking John Brown out of any of those guys late in drafts. Long term, I'm still kind of there with Ruggs, but just this season, you know, John Brown can step right in and do all of the same stuff that Aguilar did last season. Obviously, he's no longer there. I think John Brown is a better player than the Nelson Aguilar. It's just about him being healthy. But I think John Brown, when you look back at his career, he's kind of been that fake number 1 receiver for teams that don't really have it, for the Ravens and then for the Bills before Stephon Diggs got there. I think that's kind of what he's going to be asked to do again this season while they really work with Ruggs, maybe put him more on the inside and not throw him to the wolves on the outside quite as much. And it's not sexy. It's not, again, not one of those picks that people are going to be like, wow, what a great pick, John Brown. But John Brown just produces when he plays, and he's kind of my guy on that team this year outside of course, Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, so I actually went with Henry Ruggs here, but we did come to the same conclusion of which wide receiver do you want to play Russian roulette with. Last year, Josh Jacobs, I was just going to go in and hate on Josh Jacobs for no reason there.
Last year, Josh Jacobs had 3 touches per day.
13.2 or whatever it was. His ADOT, Henry Ruggs, was 18.2, which was the highest in the NFL of any player with 40 targets. And that's a bad matchup with Derek Carr, who just does not throw a deep ball. And my new favorite thing to do on Twitter is to find one GIF that supports your argument. And there's this really good GIF of John Brown or of Henry Ruggs in motion where he whips inside, then he whips outside, and it's a 15-yard gainer against the Bucs. Jumping into that, the Raiders used the 7th most motion last year, 52%, and they sat Henry Ruggs in motion pretty often. And he could run these short and intermediate routes. Going back to college, 33% of his routes were deep. The other 67% were intermediate and short routes at Alabama. So he has a skill set. And somehow Gruden is using play action. He's the 12th highest in the NFL's play action, 7th highest in motion. Those are 2 good things. The reason I don't pick John Brown, because I do love John Brown, is he's 31 this year. And I have questions about his health. And if he goes down, and if they just don't treat Henry Ruggs as a deep threat, he'll be good. I know John Gruden came out and said he did a great job last year being a decoy. Well, that's just never what you want to hear for a guy you're going to draft. But he was the first overall pick of a wide receiver in that draft class. I know that was questionable in and of itself, but there's capital behind him, and you just want to use him for more than like 50 targets a season.
Yeah. I think the one thing I will say is that Derek Carr really seems to, once he trusts a guy, he will look for that guy all the time. Darren Waller, obviously, and then really Nelson Aguilar last year too. It was really those 2 guys. And I can see John Brown turning into if Darren Waller is his binky, John Brown could be his blanket, his security blanket. Like, he's got to have his binky and his blanket. And I think those 2 guys, I just feel like that's more likely to happen than Ruggs being someone that Derek Carr truly trusts game in, game out.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Derek Carr needs his binky and his blanket.
Hey, you know what? He is a little bit of a crybaby, so it kind of fits.
All 3 of us are getting blocked by him on Twitter after that.
Hey, no binky, no blanky. You get Derek Carr looking like he did after that Chiefs game in Vegas. I wish I had that picture pulled up to screen share.
Oh my God. Yeah, we hate the Raiders around here, all their players.
Nope, not Josh Jacobs. Other than that. Dalton, anything else to add on the Vegas Raiders before we get out of here?
Last thing I want to add, fun note I found while doing research. Last season had the most rushing touchdowns in NFL history with 532. Outpacing 1979 with 487. So I expect a lot of running backs to regress with touchdowns last year. I'm looking at you, Aaron Jones.
And that is going to do it for us today on episode 35 of the Half Point Per Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at Half Point Per Pod. Look us up on YouTube if you've watched on the streams. Thank you so much. That is Half Point Per Podcast on YouTube. The newsletter, the TikTok, Instagram, all of that in the show notes. Half Point Per Pod pretty much everywhere. We will be back again. Like I said, we are weekly again. And the next show, hard to believe, we are into July now. I don't know what exactly is on deck next, but I do know we are getting closer to time for sleepers, for busts, for my guys. We're kind of getting into the fun stuff here. We're getting off of the rumor mill and onto the let's actually kind of plant our flags here. So thank you guys again for listening. Listen on iTunes, Spotify, leave us a review, all that good stuff, and we will see you guys next week.